Imagine being locked inside a prison cell. Not because you committed a crime, but because the government wanted to experiment on you. No trial. No real choice. Just a small payment, and a promise that it's safe. But behind the steel doors of American prisons in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, something disturbing was happening. Scientists weren't just studying prisoners. They were injecting chemicals into their skin, exposing them to powerful drugs, and testing substances that had never been used on humans before. Some prisoners walked away with scars. Others were left with lifelong health problems. And for decades, most Americans had no idea it was happening. Tonight, we uncover the hidden history of America's forgotten prison experiments. The perfect test subjects. After World War II, the United States entered a new scientific race. Pharmaceutical companies were developing new medicines, chemicals, and treatments faster than ever before. But every new drug needed one thing before it could reach the public: human testing. And scientists had a problem. Testing risky substances on regular citizens was nearly impossible. People wouldn't volunteer to have unknown chemicals injected into their bodies. But inside America's prisons, there was a population many researchers considered perfect test subjects. Thousands of inmates. Men with limited rights. And most importantly, men who needed moan. By the 1950s, a new system quietly began spreading across the country. Researchers would enter prisons and offer inmates a deal: participate in a medical experiment and get paid. For prisoners earning just a few cents per hour, the offer could be life-changing. Some experiments paid $10, $20, even more. For a man behind bars, that could mean extra food, cigarettes, or money for his family. So many inmates signed up. But what they often weren't told was just how dangerous these experiments could become. One prison in particular would soon become the center of one of the largest human testing programs in American history. A place where thousands of inmates would be used in experiments involving toxic chemicals, powerful drugs, and substances linked to cancer. The prison was called Holmesburg Prison. And what happened inside its walls would shock the nation decades later. Inside Holmesburg Prison. Holmesburg Prison stood in the city of Philadelphia. From the outside, it looked like any other aging American prison: high brick walls, iron gates, and rows of cramped cells. But inside those walls, something very different was happening. In the early 1950s, a dermatologist named Albert Kligman walked into Holmesburg Prison looking for volunteers for a medical study. At first, prison officials weren't sure what he wanted. But when he looked at the rows of inmates packed into small cells, he later described what he saw in a way that would become infamous. He said the prison population was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. To him, the inmates represented something rare in medical research. A large group of human test subjects, all in one place. Soon, the experiments began. Researchers started with simple skin tests. Small patches of chemicals were placed on prisoners' backs and arms to study how the skin reacted. But the experiments didn't stay small for long. Pharmaceutical companies, chemical manufacturers, and even the U.S. military began funding studies inside Holmesburg. Thousands of inmates signed up. Some were desperate for money. Others simply wanted a break from the boredom of prison life. But many had no idea what they were really agreeing to. Prisoners were injected with experimental drugs. Their skin was exposed to powerful chemicals. In some cases, doctors deliberately created wounds, just to study how the body healed. One group of prisoners had their skin exposed to dioxin, a toxic chemical later linked to serious diseases. Years later, scientists would discover that the same chemical had been used in Vietnam War defoliants like Agent Orange. Many inmates said the tests caused burning, swelling, and painful scars that lasted for years. But the payments kept the experiments going. Some prisoners reportedly earned hundreds of dollars, far more than they could make through prison work. To the researchers, Holmesburg became one of the most convenient testing centers in America. But outside the prison walls, almost no one knew what was happening. For years, the experiments continued quietly. Until one day, former prisoners began telling their stories. And the truth about America's prison experiments slowly started to come out. The government's secret interest. By the 1960s, the experiments inside prisons were no longer just about skin creams or pharmaceutical products. Something bigger had started. Behind the scenes, the U.S. government had begun funding secret research programs, projects that explored how chemicals and drugs could affect the human mind. During the Cold War, American intelligence agencies feared that enemies like the Soviet Union were developing mind control techniques. So the United States launched its own secret program. It was called Project MKUltra. The goal of this program was shocking. Scientists wanted to discover whether certain drugs could control thoughts, erase memories, or force people to reveal secrets during interrogation. To do that, they needed human subjects. And once again, prisons became a convenient place to find them. Inside facilities like Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, inmates were offered money to participate in drug studies. Some were given powerful hallucinogens. Others were exposed to experimental compounds that had never been tested on humans before. One of the most controversial substances used in these studies was LSD. Prisoners were told the drug was part of a harmless research experiment. But many later said they experienced terrifying hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and psychological trauma that lasted long after the tests ended. Some inmates described feeling trapped inside their own minds, unable to escape the effects of the drug. In other experiments, prisoners were exposed to substances designed to study how the brain reacts under extreme stress. Researchers recorded their reactions. They took notes. And then they moved on to the next subject. For the scientists and intelligence agencies involved, these experiments were seen as necessary during the Cold War. But for the prisoners, the experience could be life-altering. Many later claimed they had never fully understood the risks when they agreed to participate. And for decades, the truth about these secret programs remained hidden from the public. Until the 1970s. When journalists and government investigators finally began uncovering documents that revealed just how far these experiments had gone. What they discovered would shock the country and raise serious questions about ethics, human rights, and the limits of scientific research. The scandal finally explodes. For years, the experiments inside American prisons remained hidden from the public. Most Americans had no idea that prisoners were being used to test powerful drugs, toxic chemicals, and experimental treatments. But in the early 1970s, the silence finally began to break. Investigative journalists started asking questions. Former prisoners began speaking out about what had happened inside places like Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. They described painful chemical burns, terrifying drug reactions, and experiments they never fully understood. Their stories began attracting national attention. Soon, the U.S. government itself was forced to investigate. One of the most important investigations came from the United States Senate in 1975. This investigation became known as the Church Committee investigation. What the committee uncovered shocked the country. Secret government programs had funded human experiments for years, sometimes without proper consent. Documents revealed that the CIA's controversial project, Project MKUltra, had conducted tests using powerful mind-altering drugs like LSD. In some cases, the subjects didn't even know they were being experimented on. The revelations caused outrage across the United States. Newspapers called it a massive violation of human rights. Medical experts began questioning how such experiments had been allowed to continue for so long. Under growing public pressure, the U.S. government introduced strict new rules for human research. In 1974, new federal regulations were created to protect people participating in medical experiments. Soon after, ethical guidelines were strengthened through the Belmont Report, which emphasized three key principles: respect for people, beneficence, and justice. These principles were meant to ensure that no group of people, especially prisoners, could be easily exploited again in medical research. By the late 1970s, most prison experiments across the United States had been shut down. But for the thousands of inmates who had already taken part, the damage had already been done. Many former prisoners claimed they were still suffering from long-term health problems. Others said they had been used as human guinea pigs for profit and government research. And for decades, they fought to have their stories heard. The fight for justice. When the truth about the prison experiments finally came out, many Americans assumed justice would quickly follow. But for the former inmates, the fight was only beginning. Thousands of prisoners who had participated in experiments at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia began speaking publicly about what they experienced. Some showed scars that still covered their backs and arms. Others described chronic health problems that appeared years after the tests. Many said they had never truly understood what they were agreeing to. Yes, they had signed consent forms. But those forms often used complex medical language. And in prison, where inmates earned only a few cents per hour, the payments offered for experiments could be extremely tempting. For some prisoners, the choice didn't feel like a choice at all. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, former inmates tried to file lawsuits against the researchers and companies involved. One name appeared again and again in these accusations: Albert Kligman, the dermatologist who had led many of the experiments at Holmesburg. Kligman maintained that the studies were legal and that prisoners had volunteered. But critics argued that the system itself was deeply unfair. Powerful pharmaceutical companies had gained valuable data, while the men who took the risks were left with lifelong consequences. Decades later, many of those former prisoners were still demanding compensation. Some believed the experiments had caused cancer, skin diseases, or other long-term health issues. Yet proving those claims in court was incredibly difficult. Medical records were incomplete, and many of the companies involved denied responsibility. In 2000, the disturbing history of the experiments reached a wider audience when journalist Alan M. Hornblum published a book called Acres of Skin. The book revealed just how extensive the prison testing program had been. According to investigations, thousands of inmates had participated in experiments at Holmesburg alone. Some historians now consider it one of the largest human testing programs ever conducted inside an American prison. Today, the story of these experiments serves as a warning, a reminder of what can happen when science, profit, and power collide, without strong ethical limits. Modern medical research in the United States now follows strict ethical rules designed to protect human subjects. But the hidden history of prison experiments still raises difficult questions. Questions about consent, about justice, and about the men whose bodies were used in the name of progress. For decades, their stories remained buried behind prison walls. Now, they are finally being told. And the question remains: How many other forgotten experiments are still hidden in the shadows of history?